The actions need to be put in place this decade if we are to secure a future for not just nature and the climate, but ourselves on this planet.
Oceans cover about 70% of the world's surface, and they may be home to as much as 80% of all life on the planet. But despite their vastness, they're also in dire need of protection.
Well, I refer to this next decade as the last chance decade for both biodiversity and climate. And the two are entirely interlinked. We have to address the climate crisis if we are to conserve life on Earth, and biodiversity ecosystem management is a core part of addressing the climate crisis.
Neville Ash is director of the UN Environment Programme's Conservation Monitoring Centre.
The actions need to be put in place this decade, internationally, nationally, and locally, by governments and others, and the private sector, if we are to secure a future for not just nature and the climate, but ourselves on this planet.
Currently, only 8% of the world's oceans are protected, and only 2% from damaging or extractive practices. But the UN Global Biodiversity Framework attempts to change that by protecting 30% of the world's land and sea by 2030. And it's hoped this will be signed and adopted in Kunming, China next year.
This is an international drive to expand the area of the planet under protection, both on land and at sea. For the last 10 years or so, the world has been embarked upon trying to achieve targets to expand protection of the sea to 10% and of the land to 17% by 2020. Now we're negotiating a series of new targets, and the aim is to increase the area of both land and sea under protection to 30% by 2030.
Callum Roberts is a professor of marine conservation at Exeter University in the UK. He spent decades making the case for stronger protection of marine life.
If we want to protect nature, if we want to stop the loss of biodiversity across the world, if we want to support fisheries, if we want to address the impacts of climate change, all of those things require us to be protecting more of nature. And the more ambitious of the Paris Agreement targets, the best pathways to achieving just 1.5 degrees of warming by the end of this century, those include large amounts of mitigation by establishing larger areas of vigorous wild nature to suck up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the ocean environment has a big role to play in that.
It's such an ambitious goal, but it's going to be pretty hard to enforce, isn't it, without buy-in from local communities that depend on the ocean or fishing for their livelihoods.
The trajectory has been in the wrong direction for a long time, and we've been managing fisheries rather poorly. And if we leave them in that condition, with fish getting smaller, catches going down, then it's not going to do those communities any good in the long term either. So one of the things that we have to do is to transition to more sustainable use of the ocean. And part of that package is going to be protected areas. Another part is better fisheries management in the surrounding areas. Both indigenous communities and industrial fishermen stand to gain from that transition. The hard part is making it easy for them to continue to make a living as the change happens.
Yes, in terms of better fisheries management, we currently spend around $35 billion in fishing subsidies. That can't be right, can it?
So we're actually paying people to overfish by paying these subsidies. It's almost like drugs. You've got to get off the subsidies if you're going to get healthy again. That's difficult, but it can be helped by the redeployment of those subsidies to supporting greater protection, allowing fishermen to transition to more sustainable ways of catching fish.
Yeah, we need to get to a place where everything we do is sustainable, don't we? So that makes me think of bottom trawling, which destroys ecosystems on the seabed, which are needed to replenish fish stocks. Does this still even go on in protected areas?
There are many protected areas that have been established which allow bottom trawling and dredging for mollusks to go on. That's not a protected area. That's just a paper park. And we need to make sure that these areas are properly protected. Not only is bottom trawling bad for fish and their habitats, but it also is bad for carbon that's trapped in seabed sediments. And What it does is it stirs it all up into the water again, and then it can be remineralized into carbon dioxide and essentially increase the sort of rate of global warming.
Our oceans absorb 30% of all excess carbon dioxide emissions and 90% of heat caused by global warming, so they are crucial in maintaining our climate.
We urgently need deep emission reductions, and we're getting to a stage where we're going to need to start to remove carbon from the atmosphere. All of that needs to happen in a way in which doesn't undermine other ambitions, poverty and addressing poverty, conserving nature. So there are many safeguards that need to be put into place in the way in which we take forward our climate ambitions. But underlying all of this is the concern that all of our lives, and indeed the future of nature on the planet, is dependent on stabilizing the climate, and that requires deep greenhouse gas emission reductions at the heart.
Given how much land-based agriculture contributes to climate change, our oceans also have a crucial role in the future of global food security, don't they?
Seafood is a very good food. It's very nutritious, lots of protein and micronutrients in it. And so it's good to eat, but we need to manage fisheries much better if we want to sustain that into the future. Aquaculture will have to play a big part in that, but not the kind of aquaculture which is happening in many places right now. There's very damaging open ocean net cage fish farms, which are just huge sources of pollution to the surrounding environment. They're causing impacts on wild fish stocks through the transmission of diseases from these crowded populations to the wild fish. So we need to get our act together with marine aquaculture if it's going to contribute to feeding the world in the future.
Yeah, and as if what we're doing already to our oceans wasn't enough, we've now got the imminent danger of deep sea mining, which you and most scientists agree is just an environmental disaster waiting to happen.
The island of Nauru is working with a company called Deep Green to make sure that mining starts quickly underwater. And there are lots of minerals on the deep sea bed, but getting them is going to be very destructive, not just of the life in the places that you're mining, but all the tailings, which then are dispersing across huge areas of ocean and into some of the most sensitive environments in the world. These are places that experience hardly any change or disturbance right now. And when you introduce this kind of disruption, it's going to have massive ramifications.
Scientists agree that the 30 by 30 protections will make all the difference to the complex puzzle of climate change, biodiversity, and food security we currently face. That's because our oceans, despite all the problems they face, are extremely resilient. The question we really have to ask is, will these changes happen soon enough, and will they be real enough? Because when you get right down to it, what we're actually talking about is the survival of us.
Yeah, we're talking about securing a future for humanity. I mean, yes, there are 1 million species at risk of extinction, and that is a tragedy, and we have to put in place the actions to address that. But actually, the consequence of that is not just for far-flung parts of the planet or species many people have never heard of, potentially, but for ourselves. Our food, our livelihoods, our societies, and our economies all depend on that nature.
It's finished. But don't worry, we've got a lot more Razor stories for you. All you need to do is like, comment and subscribe and hit the bell button below for notifications. We'll see you next time.